On the 17th of April this year, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister released the inaugural Defence Strategy. It was hailed as a fundamentally new approach because Australian forces faced the most complex and challenging strategic environment since the Second World War. Well, so what of this strategy? The Australian government has adopted a strategy of denial. A simple interpretation of this could mean that the ADF will be integrated and focused. The ADF will seek to impose or hold at risk any potential adversary. This means that the cost for an adversary to act will be much more than any benefit they may seek to gain or retain. But to drill down, so what of this strategy for Army? Is this just a revision of the Defence of Australia doctrine? Are we focused on defending an air-sea gap? And if so, does that relegate the Army's role to, as has been criticised previously, simply bayoneting the shipwrecked and downed aircrew? Or when we visualise this strategy, is it the old concentric circles model of firstly protecting our shores, then the air-sea gap, preventing basing in our region and maintaining a balance in our area? Or has our thinking developed since then over the past several decades? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2nd Australian Division's last Tuesday of the month Professional Military Education. My name is Major Jeremy Barraclough and I'll be your host for this evening. The focus of tonight's topic is the National Defence Strategy and implications for the Australian Army. Our navigator as we explore this topic was the co-lead of the 2023 DSR Secretariat. He's also an award-winning author and Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the US Studies Centre, Professor Peter Dean. Some quick notes before we start as usual. This is part of a CoveTalk series recorded on the 27th of August 2024. All the information presented here is deliberately the unclassified level, and views presented here are those of the individual presenting them and not the official positions of the Australian Army, Department of Defence or the Australian Government. Lastly, thanks to our program partners being the Cove, the Australian Army Research Centre and the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess. Please subscribe to their social media so you can get more PME to you, and do tell a friend and leave a review because this is how we connect. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome our speaker, Professor Peter Dean.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks everyone in the room and for everybody online as well. I have to say, I admitted to Jeremy that I tossed over in my mind a couple of different ways to get after this topic. And I did get caught on one particular thing. There is a new way we're doing defence policy making as a result of the DSR. It is a focused force, as we know, is identified against a potential for major war in our region. And one of the things, hopefully the enduring features of the DSR, is that we've moved to a net assessment-based way to do defence policy planning. And that is built around a series of credible scenarios signed off by government, which inform the force structure of the ADF. The issue is those credible scenarios are some of the most classified things held in defence, so I can't really talk about them here today. So what I thought, rather than finding a way to talk about them without talking about them, I'd try and give you some tools to analyse the defence policy, the new National Defence Strategy as you see it, and also to talk about one particular area, which is the role of concepts, which Jeremy and I were discussing. So I have to say, and this is my personal view and observation, as a defence force and as an army, we have not really been good at doctrine and concept development. I think one of the reasons for that in the last number of decades is in the old Defence of Australia era, when we were concerned about hypothetical low-level or escalated low-level threats, the tactical proficiency of our army was pretty much spot on. Now we have to think much more about operational level ways of conducting operations and their impact on strategy. And the other difference is, rather than low level and rather than a supposed Missourian or Cimmerian adversary, we now have to worry about a major war in our region involving major powers. And that is a fundamentally different way that the Army has had to think about fighting since 1956. And if you go back and think about the DSR, and the NDS in particular talks about the need to do mobilisation planning, not only in the military but across the country, then the last time we did that was the 1956 strategic basis paper, when we were actually considering that back then that Army would have to raise a third AIF, and that would most likely go off and fight once again in the Middle East, or if not, it would once again go off and fight in Malaya and Southeast Asia. Post-1956, we moved on to the threat of communist counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia in our region, and of course then into the DOA era. So this is something we haven't done since the 1950s, and it means also that now we've identified what that threat is. We're much able to mobilise and focus on that, and that's why the emphasis on a focus force coming out of the DSR, an integrated force as well. But I think strategy, well, I know strategy is an iterative process. The start of it was the DSR, and inside the DSR, the independent leads talked about minimum viable capability in the shortest possible time. They also said that the approach to strategy in the DSR has to be the minimum viable DSR in the shortest possible time, because what would follow, as we saw within a year or about a year later, was an NDS, which is the next iteration. And of course, the next version in about 2 years' time of the NDS will iterate that strategy and develop it further. One of the things I think we're kind of missing in that space is some more concept development and doctrinal development about how the Army and how the ADF is actually going to fight against that adversary in our region and against those mission sets that we're being provided. So what I want to do is to a little bit about what makes, in my view, good defence strategy, and you can give you some tools to assess the NDS against and future iterations, and then we can talk a little bit about the concept stuff. I'm going to start with a magical formula. I will explain my formula. And I'll start with this version of the formula is something that I inherited from a colleague that I had at ANU for a very long period of time, Hugh White, who is a former author of the 2000 Defence White Paper and, of course, a very well-known commentator on Australian defence issues. And Hugh teaches or taught for a very long time Australian defence policy making. He said, this is how you make defence policy. You start with your strategic environment, the SE, and you make an assessment of the environment that you're living in, and then you make a consideration of what are your national interests within that environment, and then you decide what are the objectives you are trying to achieve with this particular policy and with the use of military force in international affairs. When you figure all of that out, that should give you an idea of the type of forces that you need and what you want those forces to do, which then will inform what capability decisions that you make. When you figure out what capability you need and you map this all out, that will tell you how much it's going to cost to build your defence force. So you should do it in a linear way in that direction. But as Hugh often points out, most governments prefer to do it in this direction. Most governments prefer to decide how much money they would like to spend as part of their budget on defence strategy. They tell the Defence Department and the military this, then the department and the ADF sits around and decides how they can divide that money up. And under the balanced force DOA era, we basically divided the money a third, a third, a third between the three services. It was an exceptionally balanced force in that regard. And then we'd all figure out, largely informed by each services, what type of capabilities they would like, because there was no concept of how we were really going to fight as an ADF in a combined way. And then we would kind of try and map that backwards against what objectives we think we're going to do, what's our environment, and what's the world that we live in. I have a derivative of this. I like to add two other elements. The first part of it is over R, to make it more of a mathematical looking formula. And R is simply risk. What we are in the business in strategy and defence policy making is managing risk as best as we can. So you have to consider this against the threats that you're facing, the type of risks that you're exposed to, how soon you think those risks might appear or become something you have to deal with, and the factor of time in relation to those risks, and where you think that risk environment is. And as we've seen from the NDS and the DSR, the risk is, as Jeremy said at the beginning, some of the most complex strategic circumstances we've had since the Second World War. So the government is telling us the risks we are facing as a nation is very high this time around. It's no longer low-level or escalated low-level hypothetical stuff. It's actually the threat of major war within a 10-year period in our region. I put C over Cs. This is concepts over capability, and I think this is where I want to get to at the end of my talk. What is the concept of how we're going to fight as an army? What is the concept of how we're going to fight as a defence force? What is the concept of the way that we're going to fight integrated with our ally, the United States and New Zealand, and our partners as well into the region? Because this is what we do. And particularly when we're trying to deter a major nuclear armed power, We tend not to do that as a small country on our own. You do that in partnership with your allies and partners. And of course, the denial strategy is if deterrence fails and we end up in conflict, at least at the highest level, the NDS has conceptually outlined what is the concept at a very high defence policy level of how we're going to fight. The question then is, what is the role of the services underneath that, and what is the role of Army in particular against that? And then that should inform your money. Now, what I'll have to say, I'm very happy to say, when we had a big discussion in the DSR with the independent leads of how we go about that process, Stephen Smith and Angus Houston were very clear, we've got to go back to first principles. We've got to not just assume and accept everything that had come in white papers and other things from the past. So they started with looking at the strategic environment and what did the Defence Strategic Update in 2020 said, and update that document. And unfortunately, things did not get any better. Then re-looking at what our interests are, what are our objectives and where they're focused and what are the risks that we face. And that is what they use to then inform. In fact, we didn't get to discussions on capability very deliberately, even though in Australia, everyone wants to talk about capability. In the public debate in Australia about defence policy making, it is largely a debate over kit and capabilities, not over strategy. I think it's one of our failings in our sort of national security debates in Australia. It's normally the second half. It's about what kit we want to buy and how much is it going to cost and how much is defence going to get funded. The last thing I'll add is this. You have to put a big circle around it and a P for politics, because none of this exists in a hypothetical world by itself. It all exists inside politics, and as Clausewitz reminds us, strategy is a continuation of policy, and politics by other means. All strategy is political. You can't say, oh, that's a political decision to the government, because everything they make in relation to strategy is a political decision. The choice to invest or not invest in something, the choice to do defence policy one way or the other, is in fact a strategic decision. So that's my shorthand of how you make defence policy. And then what I believe it is, it sits on a series of questions we need to ask ourselves. And so I would pose these questions for you to have a think about, read the National Defence Strategy, read the Integrated Investment Plan, and then have a think about what is it we are trying to do and why are we trying to do that? These are really somewhat simple and fundamental questions, but we forget to ask, what is it that we want what is the Army for and what do we want it to actually do? It sounds really self-evident, but when you strip it back and have a think about that, you can do multiple different things with land power to achieve multiple different outcomes. Decisions that inform that are all based on judgments. They are intelligence-informed decisions, but they are still in the end judgments, some of which is informed by hard data, but no one can really know. If you remember the good old known unknowns, known knowns and known unknowns from Donald Rumsfeld at the time, where everyone looked at that press conference and said, what is this guy doing? He was actually not wrong, right? We do have known knowns. We know certain things. We think we know certain things, and we know there are things out there we just do not know. So strategy is rather squishy. You know, we make assumptions, and what you have to do is constantly come back and test your assumptions that you're making. Our hopes, our fears, and our half-articulated ideas and attempts to predict the future all will inform this, because nobody knows what the future will be, yet we're trying to design a defence force for the future that will make us secure on the best information that we have. But if you know how to predict the future, let me know. There's some lotto numbers I'd like to put in this week, and a few horse races and football games I'd like to bet on. But it is the fog of war and the fog of strategy. We don't know. And as much as it's intelligence formed, what our fears are and what our hopes of what the world would like to be like does really inform what we do. Where are we getting that evidence? What are the arguments to do? As said, what kind of forces do we need to execute the strategy that we have? What do we want these forces to do? So in this case, we need them to undertake a denial strategy to find an asymmetric capability edge against a superior enemy, at least in terms of numbers and size and capability. We know from the NDS and the DSR that we need to undertake an A2AD, an anti-access area denial strategy within our northern approaches. These are the things that can then help inform us to make decisions about how we fight the force and what we do down the back end of the concepts. Where should they be based? So that's the force posture part of it. And what levels of readiness do they need to be held at? Because we know if you hold a force at high readiness, that is expensive. it costs a lot of money, and you need a bigger force to ensure that a sizable component of it is ready for a much higher period of time. And that comes to your levels of preparedness. So we used to have 10 years of warning time, for instance. What we could do in capability decisions, we could always try time was a variable factor. And I've heard the CDF talk about this when he rebuilt the IIP. He said, we used to be always say, oh, we can just push that money out a few years and we can pull this thing here and we can move things around because we had 10 years of strategic warning time. Taking that away took away the luxury of time, so we now need to trade money or capability instead. So either not get that capability or accept a lower level of capability. We may not get the infantry fighting vehicle that we want, or we may not get the howitzer that we want, but can you get it in the time that you need it for an 80% solution? Because something that's 80% now is better than something that comes 5 years too late that's 110% better than the other one. And of course, how does this relate to your risk and the threat? So in my world, a threat is a capability plus intent. So I was in Taiwan last week. There is a clear intent from the Chinese Communist Party to force Taiwan back into the fold. And Xi Jinping has said multiple times he's willing to leave all options on the table. The question is, does he have the capability to actually achieve that? What we're trying to do is deny his ability to do those things. What are our policy aims? Have we rigorously explored all the alternate options and different strategies and approaches and way to do this? There's a whole nother talk I can give about Australian strategic culture, but we largely depend on a self-reliant, alliance-based approach to strategy. Other people have put forward an armed and independent Australia. Others have an unarmed and neutral Australia as their particular approach to do it. Other versions of doing it is within a collective defence framework. So what are the big picture things that we considered? What are their cost-benefit analysis ratio? What is the risk you're trying to mitigate? What level of risk are you willing to take? So if we have a high threat and a low response, we say as a country we're accepting very high risk. But if we have a low risk and we invest a lot into our defence force and a lot into our military, we're going to have very low risk. But at what costs? Because every money about a dollar that goes to defence policy is not going to housing policy or infrastructure or education or healthcare or the other components of our society. And what level of investment in risk management are we willing to take over the long term? So in the Defence of Australia era, we said it's low level and escalated, low level ret. So we had 10 years of warning time in case of any major conflict. So we could keep a relatively balanced force, knowing that finally when the 10 years went away, we could start to focus that force on whatever that threat is, which is exactly what we did with the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, the 2023 DSR and the 2024 NDS. It's like the era of warning time is over, so we need to focus that. And so we've gone from a range of potential threats and having a regionally superior military to everyone else in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. And we're offsetting that by the time it takes to build our capabilities and our level of investment in our industry. And we saw, for instance, the higher level of threat we're having, the higher risk we have. And last week, the government announced we're going to build a Kongsberg missile factory in Newcastle to produce, Kongsberg Joint Naval Strike Missile and Joint Strike Missile, which is designed to sink ships in our northern approaches as a maritime country. And the government's made that investment because we need to have some level of self-reliant capability to do that because of the risk that we face. What is the alignment of our force plans with our strategic objectives? What is the alignment of our funding with our strategy? Now that question is where most of the political risk for government resides, because that is where most of the public debate resides. So the constant debate in the Australian debate of, are we spending enough on defence policy? Are we spending it quick enough? What is the right levels of defence spending? If you listen to the opposition at the moment, they'll say we need to spend more. And if you listen to the government say we are spending more compared to what the other guys did. And the debate is the money in, say, the IIP focused out in the right way? And some things, I will point out, money cannot solve your problem. So there are certain areas in defence where the government could give the military or defence a huge amount of money, but because of global supply chains, the time to develop capability and stuff, we may just not be able to get our hands on that particular equipment because we don't build it all ourselves or we don't do certain things for ourselves. And we're relying on our allies and our partners in global supply chains. Capability choices must be driven by those strategic objectives, so the shape, deter, respond, and all the other things that sit in the NDS. And they should be in the most cost-effective way, as I said, trading off time, capability, mix, and the cost. A few caveats I want to put in place. Ambitions and risks are limitless, and resources are finite, and strategy is about making decisions. That is the most fundamental thing to remember in this whole process. You are all paid as leaders in the Army and the ADF to make decisions. You make tactical decisions or other decisions. Ultimately, it's strategy. We make decisions about, and not doing something is as much as a decision as deciding to do something. And what we know from history is not doing anything and not making a decision is the worst possible outcome. So, but our resources are always finite. And this is one of the debates I often have, because we talk about money in the public debate a lot. People think there's endless, often rivers of gold of money to fund the Defence Department. Government has to make decisions because money that goes to the Defence Department doesn't go to, as I said, health or industry policy or so, whatever other area. Which is the offsets. Also, what else are the other national security risks? What about terrorism? What about pandemics? What about climate change? What about irregular migration? What is the risk matrix and factor here? How much political support is there for this strategic approach for the threat? Do the public understand and appreciate the threat the same way that we do? How is the public being engaged with in that? And how much support is there for defence spending? And I tell you what, you look at most public opinion surveys, people don't want to spend money on us. They only want to spend money if they're really worried about the risk and the threat. They'd much prefer the money to go to their children's health and to our education system and other areas. Although we have seen an uptick in general public support at the last election, in spite of the cost of living pressures for more money to go to our Defence Force as well. And it's all driven by, there's institutional agendas, there's service cultures and service backgrounds we've got to do, there's industry preferences about what they would like to do and where they would like to get the money. Competing governments, so the opposition may have a different view, the government in exile. Other states and the territories in a federated system aligned with what the national government's trying to do and what are their priorities. And what is about the reverse logic? Are your strategic objectives just selected to justify capabilities that have been chosen for other reasons? I would argue for a long time, the services in particular drove capability decisions about things that they wanted rather than things that we may necessarily have needed, because there wasn't the concepts that are involved or there wasn't necessarily the threat environment to drive specific outcomes. And that's one of the fundamental things that's changed. If you want to know where priorities are, look where the money goes. So this is a chart out of the Integrated Investment Fund. That is a percentage orientation of where our defence money is going for the next 10 years. That will tell you what defence's priorities really are. Because what you spend your money on, irrespective of what you plan your family budget to be, if you actually look at what you're spending your money on, is what you really prioritise and your decisions. And you see a considerably large investment, as we've seen, in undersea warfare, in maritime capabilities, and then an amphibious capable combined arms land system down the bottom, but 11% there. So this is what's driving the way that they've assessed the strategic environment and the solutions that were coming up in the strategy about it. But they're your real priorities. And the question is, are these the right ones mapped against the strategy at the beginning of the document to make your assessments? I want to throw out just a couple of things. The other thing is how you assess and visualize that strategic environment. Is that the strategic environment we're trying to manage with hard power, with the use of military force in international affairs, which is what strategy is all about? We're viewing it that way, or do we do it this way? This is the Defence of Australia concentric circles map that was looked at before, and that the closer you are to the Darwin centre point, the more important it is, the further away, the less important it is. Do you look at it like this? That is the primary operating environment in red of the 2009 Defence White Paper. Where is it that we think we live? This is a Lowy poll for people who can't see. That's basically asking people in Australia, which region do we actually belong to in that globe and on those different maps? And so what you're talking about there is, do we belong to the Indo-Pacific, which is the red ones, or do we belong to Asia, or do we belong to Oceania? And there's sort of a mix of combinations, but largely people think we're part of Oceania, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. Or do you see the world like that? And that is the one map out of the Defence Strategic Review. So it's a slightly different orientation, and if you look at what it says our areas of priority to operate in, it aligns against that map. I have my own version of that map which zooms in a little closer on the same orientation, and what the current defence strategy says, that is the area that's important, from the Northeast Indian Ocean at the top of the map to New Zealand and the South Pacific at the bottom of the map. And you can see which parts of Australia are physically closest to Southeast Asia and East Asia, particularly North Asia, where we're concerned with the rise of China and the relative distances. So how you see the world also helps you inform that. And that map, is also critical to the concept of how we're going to fight the army. There is a reason is an amphibious-enabled littoral combined armed landing system, because the dominant terrain is water and small and large islands, which is an archipelago, and littorals. So that is the dominant terrain within that operating environment that the government has set for the Defence Force. This is a list, so you've also got to consider threats. So we can all read the NDS and look at the way they assess the strategic environment, in particular the forceful language that's being used around the concerns on China and Russia and stuff in the region. From an Australian citizen's point of view, what do they say? Cyber attacks is the thing they worry about the most, and we know we're in daily conflict in the cyber realm. The second most important is a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. So the major war scenario, one of the potential ways in a flashpoint that a war scenario should be fought, which is also lining up to the NDS and the DSR's concern about major power conflict. If you want to have a bit of a broader approach to that, just very quickly, Penny Wong gave a speech the week before the DSR was released. I recommend to everybody to always go back. That's a wonderful reference point about what Australian strategy actually is. She makes it really clear. She didn't use these titles, I added them in, but she makes a clear aim. Our job is to avert war and maintain peace. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by deterrence, by denial with our allies and partners in the region. We want a region to avoid, what I like about it said, this is the world that we don't want to live in. We don't want to live in a closed hierarchical world where the rules are dictated by a single major power that suits its own interests. In other words, we don't want a region dominated by China, who's the most likely major power to be able to do that. And the tasks we need, harnessing our national power to stop strategic competition from coming unchecked in our region, defend Australia and our immediate region, deter through denial any adversaries' attempts. This is also coming out of the DSR, this stuff now. Protect Australia's economic connection to the world, contribute to our partners, and the last part there is what's in the NDS. So we have a clear list, an aim of what we're trying to achieve, and a clear list of tasks from the government. The approach we know, as I said, is a balance of power, an allies and partners approach, a region that has rules, standards, and norms that people apply to. That we don't have another hegemon other than our alliance partner. And as the DSR said, the US unfortunately is no longer the hegemon in our region. But as long as nobody else is, we can live in a multipolar region. Deter by denial and balance our hard and soft power, where the diplomacy that we do is backed up by credible military force, because without that, it's not there. We need to do this through national defence, as we said, denial operations, through an asymmetric capability edge now. We don't have dominance against a major power, so we need to look at things such as AUKUS and the Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance Enterprise and other technological enhancements to get an edge over our adversaries where they do not have an edge. And we know about the integrated force having that list in the DSR of critical capabilities of things it needs to be able to do. The government has also given us a list of what they said their 6 priorities are in implementing this around submarines, precision strike, munitions manufacture, the Northern Base Network, our Defence Force personnel, disruptive technologies and translating them into capabilities, and our defence partnership and diplomatic relationships. These are all stuff that informs the way we've got to think about the operations that the Army, the things the Army actually has to do. This is a threat matrix from peace on one side to thermonuclear war on the other. The blue box in the middle is largely where the old defence policy was focused under the DOA era. This is where the new defence policy is focused, up on the major threat era. All right? But also we can't overlook the fact that at the bottom end of the threat spectrum, we know that these are low risk operations, things like HADR assistance and peace enforcement operations. They are low strategic risk to our country. They are very high probability. The chances of the Army being deployed on these are very high, but the overall strategic risk is very low. The red box, the chance that we do this is very low. The risk that we carry is extreme, in extremis type of risks. So that's why we prepare for the red box, knowing that we also have to operate in the yellow box. The blue box may occur, but we might have some more warning time about that, and it might often largely be driven by things coming out of the yellow box and the changing nature of our strategic environment. So we know for Army, we have to develop anti-access area denial capabilities. We know we need to get into air and missile defence. We know we need to get into land-based maritime strike and long-range fires. We know we need to get into a integrated amphibious capable combined arms land system because of that archipelagic environment that we live in. We know that there is different levels of conflict too. We are in strategic competition at the moment. There is a risk that we might have limited conflict, and I would argue that in the cyber realm we live in the limited conflict domain right now. It is conflict, it is happening now and has been happening for years. And then there is the major war box at the beginning. So what type of forces do we need for strategic competition? And the things that we do, like international engagement, we may not do in the other end of the box, but is about setting the conditions for us to be able to operate in the other boxes, or hopefully deterring from us ever getting to the limited conflict or the other box. So I want to come back to finish off on, and what this is really about is hopefully giving a set of tools and discussion points for you to have in your messes and in your units and your discussion about how this system all works. But I want to come back to the concepts part. As I said, is my personal opinion is something we have not done well as a Defence Force and as an Army, particularly concepts that work at the operational level of war and the way they inform particular strategic outcomes. We haven't had as much requirement, I don't think, before as we do now to actually achieve these things. And that requires not me as a professor standing up here and giving you my view. This requires the institution of Army to have a conversation with itself, led by the Chief of Army, informed by what the CDF is requiring Army to do in the government. And it has to be a culturally understood system of ideas that's ingrained through the learning and training systems, but it has to be an intellectual idea, because that's what all concepts and doctrine are. They're ideas to inform, they're not things to be rigidly followed. And I'll give a quick historical example. In 1940, we knew about tanks, we knew about artillery, we knew about close air support, and we knew about all the things that inform our combined arms fighting system we have now. The French had better tanks than the Germans. The French had better artillery than the Germans. They had about a comparable air force, but it was actually larger when combined with the British and others on the Allied side. What the Germans had is came up with a concept of how to fight that system, how to integrate that system, and a doctrine that was understood in their military of how they were going to do that, that despite having inferior equipment, they were able to win a decisive victory in 1940 through their blitzkrieg tactics. That is built on concepts and doctrine and thinking. It is not built on the fact that they had a better tank than the French had. So it's that intellectual, cultural and doctrinal approach that was fundamentally key to how they achieved tactical and operational success. Now, longer term, they didn't have a great strategy of how to win a war, but at least at the operational level, they had concepts and doctrine of how they thought that was aligned to their strategy. And they knew they had to fight and win quickly. They knew a war of attrition against France was not going to go in their favour. So they needed blitzkrieg or lightning war to make it happen quickly to get to the end state that they needed, at least in that particular conflict. We know we're going to do things with allies and partners. Some of it we're going to have to do on our own because we need to be self-reliant, although not self-sufficient. We know we have to be part of an integrated force. This is not Army going off and doing things alone. It is integrated with Army, Navy, Air Force, with space and cyber as well. So we have to do this thinking within that construct and framework. We know we've got to do denial. We know we have to deny the adversary the achievements of its objectives. We know we have to hold them at risk, even in peacetime. We need to raise the costs of what it would be for them to achieve, that they can't achieve an objective without the imposition of cost, and hopefully that cost is so high they change their mind and decide to do something else. We know where our primary operating environment is. The National Defence Strategy and the DSR makes it clear the arc from Northeast Indian Ocean to maritime Southeast Asia into the South Pacific, a region dominated by archipelagos and littorals. We know that mainland Australia is now a critical base of operations, not just for us, but for our US alliance partner as well. A platform for which to project power, but also a platform that we know, because of the increasing ranges of missiles of our adversaries and capabilities, that was in the envelope to be directly attacked. We know that that northern base network is critical, and we know we have some higher level concepts, such as integrated campaigning and the concept of SPY, the ADF theatre concept. They are that higher level framework of which Army needs to have that discussion of how it's going to operate as a system. Are they fit for purpose? You know, are the functional concepts of maritime, air, lane, cyber and spy require joint effects, and how are they going to operate? But I would argue, I still don't know. I know big high level frameworks, but I still don't know how the ADF really is actually going to fight if it ends up in that major war. I really don't know how Army's version is going to evolve. There's many potential probable futures here, but it's incumbent upon the organisation and the institution to have these conversations all the time and to start to codify them into doctrine and concepts of how we're going to fight. We know we're talking about major war here. This is not going to look like Afghanistan. It is not going to look like Iraq. It is not going to look like East Timor. It is not going to look like a number of other things, but against a major power adversary, the reason that we have to get into the integrated air and missile defence game is go and have a look at the ORBAT of the Chinese Air Force and look at the simple, pure numbers they have. While they may not have the quality our Air Force has, they have mass, even when you add us with the United States of America, Japan and others. So we know we're going to have to fight for information in the electronic warfare and the cyber domains. We're going to have to fight for air, sea and land control. We're not going to have control of the air guaranteed all of the time, or control of the sea guaranteed all the time. These are things we will have to fight for, and that means the way we fight is fundamentally different. We need to work in denied environments often, where our communications may not work, where our systems may not work. Well, it might be good that we have a missile that goes 300 kilometres, but if the fire control radar systems and the targeting doesn't work because it's been interdicted, etc., that's going to be a lived reality of how we operate. We're going to have to fight outnumbered in that major war, and we're going to have to fight for our own force protection. And that's going to be really critical. These are concepts, as I said, we have not had to think about since the 1950s. These are things we've not had to do operationally since the 1940s. And this is why it's such a big intellectual challenge for all of us. It was a long time since we fought a war where we did not have superiority or supremacy in the air. That was 1942. If you look at Korea, if you look at Vietnam, you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, they were all done under air supremacy, guaranteed. Open access to, the problem with getting air support was there enough of it and where were you in the queue? Not whether it was actually achievable or whether you had somebody else who could do that to you. So as I said, it's been a long time. There is no one with lived experience of this getting around the Department of Defence or in the Army. So the only way we can deal with this is we have to think through the problems. We have to work on our concepts. I said the DSR helped inform the NDS. Strategy is iterative, and in my view, one of the big parts that still has to evolve and iterate is the concepts of how we're going to fight. And as an ADF, as a joint and integrated force, and how Army's going to get involved in this. And for the 2nd Division, I know I'm at 2 Division Headquarters, with that force protection role in the north, one of the things that I will look at and say, if the major war started in the region and if Australia was involved, the greatest threat to those northern bases is attack by ballistic and cruise missiles. And what level of land-based integrated air and missile defence can this division deploy in its primary mission to protect those things, and what level of capability does Army have? At the moment, I think we can all assume there's not a lot of it. But in the absence of it, as it comes into service, we need to think about how we will do that. And the way you do that, not just with effectors like NASAMS, but how do you do camouflage, concealment, and deception operations? How do you use mobility, and how do you use all the other things that we have within the way land forces operate to offset what our potential adversaries' advantages will have? Because in the end, as we're directed, we need to come up with asymmetric responses to this. Rather than force on force, what is their weak spot and what are our advantages and how do we exploit that? I'm going to finish there, I think. So, there's no answers to my questions. I'm afraid I still have more questions than I have answers. What I'm hoping is to give you a framework to have that discussion with insight.
Well, fortunately, because you have more questions than answers, we're about to go into the session where we do pose some questions and hopefully some answers. And before we get into that, just pulling out a few things that you finished on there, talking about concepts and conversations. So by very virtue of having Professor Dean here, we are going and embarking on these conversations that we do need to get involved in, and deliberately recording this on the Cove so we continue to come back to some of this and use your methodologies as we pull apart the NDS and see what it actually means for us. And there are concepts going through, and you referred to Aspire. There's also the domain concepts that are being developed as we speak if we start exploring them through the Defence Information System. So thank you for your illumination on those sorts of things, Peter. And before we go for questions in the room, I'll just kick off with one of my own here. Right at the start, you were talking about the NDS being related to a minimum viable strategy, and I'm sort of putting words in your mouth there. If so, what is the key capability missing for a more fulsome strategy in your opinion?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I was more referring to the DSR. Certainly Stephen Smith was really focused on this during the DSR with the whole team, that we can't ask, if the 2020 Defence Strategic Review ended warning time, we couldn't take a lazy couple of years to do the DSR and then turn around and say to Defence, hurry up and go faster. So he said, you have to set the example. So from the time it was started to the time it was handed to government, I think was a record time for any significant strategic review in defence. It nearly, I have to say, it nearly broke me. And I know it worked very hard of the members of the team, but that was done very deliberately. As the lead said, an 80% solution to put defence on the right path now quickly is better than a 100% solution delivered in 2.5 years' time, saying to Defence, well, by the way, we've just absorbed 2.5 years of your warning time while we've figured out what we want you to do. It was really good that the government then delivered on an NDS within 12 months, because the DSR was an independent review. The government then accepted that review, they didn't have to, but then for the government and the department to own that strategic approach, it had to integrate that into the department, and that's what the NDS process was. This was the first go at it. We are not an ADF and a country that is really focused on deterrence as a concept, as a foundation of our strategy before. It has been a consequential outcome of other things that we've done, if you know what I mean. So by developing an F-111 capability in the 1980s and 1990s, we had a regionally superior strike capability that could do certain things that was a deterrent to people in our region. But it wasn't the reason, like deterrence wasn't that focus. It now is. So there's a whole lot of thinking about the deterrence concept that needs to go on in thinking inside the department, across all areas, and how do we organise behind that concept. And this will take time. We all have to, as an institution and organising individuals, learn and go on that journey. This is the other benefit of going into the 2-year national defence strategies. Each of them will iterate and build on the last one. So they will respond to changes in the strategic environment, but they should also respond to the development of concepts, doctrine and thinking inside the Defence Department and the ADF. And it should inform, because it's a continuous information cycle. If we get this right, that net assessment-based defence planning process should happen which will then inform and consistently and constantly update the discussions around joint force design or integrated force design, which then constantly should every 2 years update the IRP. And the one thing I'll say, I had nothing to do with the design and delivery of the NDS. That was done by the department. I'm an external independent, consumer of that, like everybody else. The one area that I have considerable concerns about is our focus on integrated air and missile defence. It's in the IIP. Most of the money for it is in the back end of the IIP. I would personally rate that risk as much higher, and I'm really concerned that we're not getting to that problem much quicker and sooner. If the department and the government came to that conclusion, within 18 months we'd have another IIP that could very well change that focus and approach and move that money around and change the priority of that project. Like, that's the beauty of not having a white paper at different intervals that take a very long time to occur, but we can constantly respond to threats, and we can constantly respond to the way the department understands its own strategy and the way it evolves its own conceptual thinking.
Great. I think it answers the question. I do appreciate that you didn't pull me up on mentioning capabilities rather than concepts. So we're starting to get some questions through on the Cove, and I do encourage you, if you do have questions out in the audience there, send them through on the number on your screen. So one relates to, if we refer back to the graphics you showed us up there, is how we're sort of tilting the globe and taking a slightly different view on the world with our strategic perspectives. And they point out that given the recent People's Liberation Army visits and increased People's Republic of China presence in Antarctica, should we be more considerate of Antarctica in our assessments? Should we start putting them on our strategic assessments and our maps and making a bit more deliberate consideration?
On the DSR map, it does appear. The other thing I like to say, this is an Army map. This comes out of the Army's contribution to strategy from 2018. And when I showed it to Stephen Smith, he's like, that's it, that's the map. That's the thing that, it has to be focused on. So Antarctica is in there. And look, yes, I think it's an important consideration, but it's about how we go about assessing what the risk from China is and its engagement in that area. What is the consideration of how important that is to us? And again, it's about resources are finite, so does the government want to either put more resources into that, or does the Defence Department recommend to government we change the existing portfolio in response to do something about that, or do we accept more risk down there? And what the NDS said is, and the DSR, is that the focus is really on Australia's northern approaches. Is that arc line that runs from this part of the country here is less of a risk that's occurring down in that part of the region, and that risk can be managed in different ways than the use and application necessarily of hard military power. And I think this is what we need to consider. The military can't do everything. The Defence Department shouldn't be asked to do everything. While the focus is on that region, it doesn't mean we don't have interest in the rest of the globe. It doesn't mean we don't have interest in the outcome of the war in Ukraine. It's just whether or not the use and application of our military power in that region is the best way to do it, or in the best focus. And I know there's a lot of debate, for instance, that we're taking command in the Red Sea of the Houthi concern, but we haven't sent a ship there. I know different people have different views on that. The government has consistently said the reason they're not doing that is because we have a very small number of surface ships, and a ship in the Red Sea is not a ship in this area which the government has said is its priority. And what I like about it, the government is making a hard decision to stick to its declared priorities. Under intense pressure from media and commentators, apparently our alliance partners or not, who knows, but sometimes sticking to your strategy is really hard under external pressures, and I would actually commend the government for making that decision. But it's about, once you focus that, sticking to your guns can actually be really hard. If you don't though, you spread yourself far too thin. And so the question for Antarctica is, how do we manage that? Is that best managed through a defence response, or is it best managed through other government departments and other parts of our more national security strategy as opposed to our national defence strategy?
Yeah, and I guess that goes to the key underlining themes of the NDS, is that it is harnessing all arms of government and all the instruments of national power. So we'll move on to it. Oh, we've got another question. Chris, can you please pass over the microphone and introduce yourself, please, ma'am?
Good afternoon, Prof. Colonel Renee Kidson, Colonel Plans at the 5th Brigade. To the extent to which concepts are the connective tissue which sort of binds together different capabilities. Just a quick comment on our doctrine. Anyone who's jumped onto the DPN lately would see that we are actually starting to develop some really strong doctrine.
Yep.
Our doctrine, though, tends to be a lag indicator. It's written on the basis of our most recent operational experience. Your exhortation to us is to use concepts as a lead indicator,
yes,
not as a lag indicator. So this means we have to imagine, in some cases reimagine, how we will fight in our region and elsewhere. An observation and then a question, Prof. So my observation is the advent of the integrated force means that in some respects, Army doesn't quite feel as though it has the lead for developing concepts. And I think it's fair to say that there's no one single mind across the ADF or the defence portfolio that has their mind around the total integrated force,
yep,
because it's so componentry. So Army doesn't feel as though it has the intellectual lead almost.
Yep.
So Prof, can you help us out here? Can you think of a historical precedent where either the Australian Army or the ADF actually had a concept-led, capability-driven strategy? Where in the past have we developed a concept in advance of our need to actually use it?
Well, I'll first of all out myself by saying I started my professional career in this particular job. I did some other things before into the public servant stuff as a military historian of Australian strategy and operations, and I'm struggling to think of an answer. I might take that on notice and go back to my mentor, Professor David Horner, who knows this better than anyone else on the planet, and actually did a lot of work on Army concepts back in his time. So I do struggle with that, and I said this is an historical thing. I think that's partly because for a long time we were part of the British Army, and we were integrated into imperial defence and to an imperial army construct, and we did a lot of our thinking either through that construct and with the British Army, and we were quite influential at certain stages of informing how that imperial construct would work. But yeah, I do, to be honest, struggle, but I think you've hit the nail on the head. What I'm trying to emphasise here is that it has to be imaginative, and this phrase, strategic imagination, is a really important one. Like, because we don't know what the future is going to hold, we have to take what knowledge we have and we have to kind of try and identify and imagine what a future world would look like and do the best we can. So Lawrence Freedman has got this wonderful book called, I'm going to get the title wrong, The Future of War, History, where he looks back in history of how different people have tried to imagine it at different times. And one of the big things is like, the air power theorists in the 1920s and how they didn't quite get it right, but they got enough of it right to build a strategic air capability that actually had a major impact on winning the war, because they used their strategic imagination based on some informed evidence and data to try and think of how that concept will be thought. I think the best contemporary example is, and he's about to come out to the event Army's having down in Land Forces in Melbourne, is General Berger from the US Marine Corps, where once they had identified out of their national security strategy and national defence strategy a problem, which was how to operate against China in the Indo-Pacific, in a very different mission set than what they'd done in Iraq and Afghanistan, he got the best minds in the Marine Corps together to war game that problem, to think through and argue that problem, to then identify what are the critical capabilities that he needed and how he needed to restructure his force. Now that was a highly, and remains a highly controversial decision, but most innovation and reform like that is. And I would say whether he's got it right or wrong, no one knows until it comes about, but the fact he made a decision, he took the best evidence he can, and he's doing something proactive, imaginative and forward-leaning, because if we only rely on the wars that we fought in the past, they may look like we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time, when we've got a different strategic problem set that we've been given, which we have, you have to look at that in different ways. And I think you're right, we can't rely on the most recent operations. They are going to be outstanding if we have to do those types of operations before, but the government is telling us that's not what we expect you to be doing. They could be wrong, well, it's a prediction of the future. So don't get rid of those lessons, file them away on how we do those types of operations, but we're going to have to use our historical imaginations because we haven't fought these types of operations in a major war in that theatre since the Pacific War, and that's the last time. That's why I use a lot of Pacific War history to inform what I do, because it's the last time we did that. A landing craft is still a landing craft. It travels at the same speed that it did in 1942 and 1945. The weapons we have are pretty similar, but you've got to add in the cyber domain, the space domain, the longer ranges things, and the different things. That's the X factors you have. Take what you do know and try and think through the X factors, and use your historical imagination. It's an untapped resource. I know General Mick Ryan likes to use sort of futuristic looking things, and he's onto something there. You've got to let your mind be open to different possibilities, and we have to do that as an organisation and an institution as well. It's a great question.
Thanks, man. So we've got time for one or two more questions, and I'll throw to Captain Blake Everson, who sent one through online. And he says, since the release of the DSR to today, have you seen any major developments to the current strategic environment which would cause a need for a change in our defence strategies? And you said it's before, it's an iterative process where we're going through. So between when you last looked at it with the DSR through to now, or what do you think is next on the horizon? And bear in mind, we're all looking at you for where we need to put our money.
Yeah, look, it's a great question as well. Look, unfortunately, and I was at the Australian Stock Exchange today talking through their risk people to the board there. I'm not the person you bring into the room when you want a rosy picture of the world. Strategists are people who sit alone in the dark, in the corner, drinking scotch, and tell you all about the bad things in the world that are going to come and hurt you. And unfortunately, the busier we are, it's reflective of the world is not so good. The world of chaos, I mean, since the DSR, the ramping up of a conflict in the Middle East, we've seen the continuation and the evolving nature of the operations in Ukraine, and the way things have changed between the relationship between Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. I mean, even a few years ago, if you had said to me that the North Koreans and Russians would enter into an alliance agreement together, people would have told you are mad. But that is the lived reality that we're dealing with today. The world is not a great place. I've spent a fair bit of time travelling in the region. I've just got back from Taiwan, where I was very lucky enough to meet President Lai Ching-te and get some briefings from their security people. And I've done the same in Japan and Korea recently. The thing I worry more and more about is the grey zone conflict we talk about. How do we have effective responses to that, and how that is actually evolving in ways very, very rapidly, and how the broader resilience part. What I like about national defence, and what I really like about the national defence strategy, is its attempt to take the concept we developed in national defence and flesh that out, because that, with the resilience measures that sit inside that, and how we have to be resilient as a society against foreign interference in elections, in our media, in the way that we operate as a society, that is the front line of all of this. Because if we don't take the public on the journey, where we explain the risks to them without spooking them, explain the importance of spending on defence and the way we're responding to things without overstating the risks and threats that we have, that's like a key centre of gravity. And I've become much more attuned, I think, to that since I did the DSR. But I will posit some of those require a defence response. A lot of those require a national security strategy, whole of government, broader response. And that's particularly the role of Home Affairs, the role of the Attorney General's Department, the role of ASIO, and we've seen the head of ASIO make a number of public statements recently. How do we coordinate that as a community, of which defence has a key role to play, not always the leading role, I think is a challenge, a journey that we're really still very much on.
Great response, and I think that draws us to a conclusion for time today, and I think one of the key points I've drawn out of your final comments there, that the only thing certain about the future is the uncertainty that is going to come about with it. And
I would say one other thing to that, what we're looking at here is an intergenerational challenge. Like the Cold War went for a couple of generations. I'm old enough to remember the ending stages of the Cold War. Unfortunately, I firmly believe that the era of strategic competition marine will be something my grandchildren will be dealing with. And that's the type of mindset we need to be in. There are risks we need to try and manage now, but there are reasons AUKUS submarines will be delivered in the 2040s and into the 2050s and beyond, because I just do not think, and the assessments we're making do not say that that competition is going away. This is the new world we live in. Unfortunately, we have to adapt to it.
And on that happy note, thank you for supporting the second division's last Tuesday of the month PME. Ladies and gentlemen, if you please put your hands together. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.